Hey folks, thanks for tuning in. This is the last episode of lecture videos for Unit 2 on biodiversity, and today we're going to talk about something called ecological succession and how it relates to disruptions. We talked about disruptions to ecosystems, but now I want to talk about what comes after. How does a biodiversity survive? How does it persist? How does it move forward from there? And this picture in the background should give you a little bit of a spoiler alert. So we talked about natural disruptions to ecosystems in the last video, and now I want to dig into, okay, well, after the fire, after the mudslide, what happens? Does biodiversity grow back? Does the ecosystem recover? If so, how does that happen, and does it look the same that it did beforehand? And in order to understand that, we need to first look at this phenomenon called ecological tolerance. Keep in mind that when a natural disruption occurs in an ecosystem, it's going to change the abiotic factors that help dictate biodiversity. It's going to change the environmental conditions of that space. Each individual species that lives in an area is going to thrive within certain ranges of abiotic factors, and that could be things like pH, temperature, sunlight, etc. There's a certain range in which species prefer to live. And there's also a range where as the temperature, for example, gets a little too high or gets a little too low, it's not ideal, it's stressful, but they can survive. And then if you go even hotter than that or even colder than that, they won't survive. That's the zone of intolerance. So this idea of ecological tolerance basically is the range in which species can survive, the range in which they can thrive. That range could apply to any one of the abiotic factors that you could come up with. And every species is going to have a different ecological tolerance for different abiotic factors, right? Organisms that live in the ocean have a pretty high ecological tolerance for salinity, and organisms that live perhaps near volcanoes probably have a higher ecological tolerance for pH and temperature. Organisms that live in wetlands have high ecological tolerance for moisture. Any disruption that is going to alter an abiotic factor could reduce the area where organisms can survive, the habitable space. It might push an organism into a zone where they're not able to tolerate the temperature or the pH or the salinity, etc. And that species is either going to migrate, adapt, or die. Here's another diagram looking at the same thing. They give you two examples with pH and temperature on the x-axis. We see this is the optimal range, the preferred niche of conditions for pH or temperature that the organism can survive. And then there are these marginal niches on the more extreme zones where the organism is going to be stressed out, but they can still tolerate it. And then beyond that is a zone where they can't live. They cannot survive. It's outside their niche. And here's a even simpler diagram showing the same thing. And as we look around the world, we tend to see these patterns with biodiversity and abiotic conditions where the more pleasant the abiotic conditions, the more biodiversity we're going to see. Areas with high biodiversity tend to have lots of access to water and moderate to warm temperatures and not too salty, not too acidic or basic, whereas areas that have low biodiversity, like the Arctic, tend to be very cold and very dry, or the desert tends to be extremely hot and extremely dry. High physical pressure makes it hard to survive. And this is a cool hypothesis called the stress gradient hypothesis. The professor I worked with in college actually came up with this, which is why I'm sharing it. You don't need to know it. But if we see on the x-axis, as physical stress, as abiotic forces get more and more intense, we're going to see that it becomes harder and harder to survive in that habitat, so organisms are going to start developing adaptations that make it easier to survive there. Polar bears develop blubber and fat and thick fur to survive the cold, harsh conditions of the Arctic. And cacti develop the succulent adaptations where they can trap water in the dry conditions of the desert. They develop adaptations that help them ameliorate their habitat. If we go in the opposite direction towards the left, we see that as physical stress decreases, consumer pressure increases, gets higher, meaning that and as you go on left, it becomes easier to survive there physically, which means that there is higher species diversity, which means there's higher competition, higher predation, so there's higher biological pressure. Right? Areas where there's high biodiversity, we see lots of competition, lots of predation. And so rather than having adaptations that make it easier to survive in those environmental conditions, we see more adaptations that make it easier to survive competition or predation based on defenses, associational defenses. These tend to be areas with high biodiversity, and these tend to be areas with low biodiversity. Again, you don't need to know this. It's just a cool model that helps explain some of the patterns we see around the globe. And it's personally close to my heart. So, how do we know if an ecosystem is disturbed? Well, it's not as simple as sending them to the therapist or asking them what type of music they've been listening to. You have to dig a little bit deeper than that. And one of the ways we do that is by looking for the presence or absence of something called an indicator species. And an indicator species is one that usually has a very narrow ecological tolerance for a certain condition, whether it's pH or salinity. And if it's very sensitive to pH, let's say, and it's present, you know that the pH is within their range, right? So it can tell you a little bit about warning signs or danger or pollution in an ecosystem. The definition, I'll just read this to you. By its presence, abundance, scarcity, or chemical composition, it demonstrates that some distinctive aspect of the ecosystem quality is present. And a great example of this are mayflies. Mayflies live in streams and brooks, but they have a very low tolerance for water pollution. They thrive extremely well in very clean, very high quality water, and if the quality dips a little bit, they will not be able to survive. It's outside their range of tolerance. And so if you have mayflies in your streams, you know that the water quality is very high. Conversely, if you don't have mayflies, you know that the water quality is not as high as it could be. And if you look on this range, you see, well, if we don't even have hog louse in our stream, we know that the water quality is probably pretty high or extreme in levels of pollution. You may be drawing connections between indicator and keystone species, but they are not the same thing. Indicator species tell us a little bit of something about the ecosystems, about certain abiotic factors based on their function or their presence. Keystone species have a significant role in the ecosystem, but they don't tell us anything about the pH or the salinity necessary. Their presence or absence can lead to a trophic cascade, but indicator species, their presence or absence does not lead to a trophic cascade. Their presence or absence just tells us about certain abiotic factors. An example of an indicator species are canaries in coal mines. Back in the old days, coal miners who were worried about carbon monoxide poisoning, a gas you can't see, smell, hear, or anything, would take canaries into the mines with them, because canaries have a lower ecological tolerance for carbon monoxide than humans do. And so the canaries would start to die before the humans would even feel the effects. So if you're mining in the coal mine and your canary starts to die, you know that it's time to get out of here. There's carbon monoxide present. On the other hand, an example of a keystone species is a sea otter. If you remove the sea otter from a kelp forest, there is no longer a predator preying on the sea urchins. And so the sea urchin population skyrockets, and they eat all the kelp, and the beautiful kelp forest turns into an urchin desert. Here's a diagram showing the pH tolerance of various different freshwater species, ranging from 4.0 to 7.0 on the pH scale. The dark figures show where the species can thrive, and the detailed figures show where they can survive, but it's not ideal. They're under stress. So why don't you answer a couple questions about this? Okay, another cool theoretical model often used in ecology to help us understand how disruptions impact biodiversity is called the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. Again, you don't need to know this for the AP exam, but it's pretty cool. So on the x-axis here, we've got the intensity, frequency, and size of the disturbances. On the left are disturbances that are very frequent. They happen all the time, and they're very large and very intense. And on the right, we've got disturbances that are less frequent, they're smaller, and they're less intense. On the y-axis, we've got biodiversity. And what we see is that in areas that have intermediate disturbances, oh, hey, look at the name. Intermediate frequency, intermediate size, and intensity of disturbances have the highest biodiversity. Why is that? Well, in areas where disturbances aren't happening very often, there's very little selective pressure. Organisms aren't used to these disturbances enough where they can actually adapt to them, and instead that leads to high biological competition. So the species biodiversity tends to dip a little bit. On the flip side, areas where disturbances are extremely intense and extremely frequent, it's very hard to live there. And there's no time to adapt because your species gets wiped out before the next disturbance even arrives. So we tend to see in nature that biodiversity persists the highest at areas where there's intermediate levels and intensities of disturbances. A great example of this is the intertidal zone. The disturbances of the water coming in with the tide every few hours and going back out, that disturbance is very regular and very predictable. It's going to lead to changes in moisture, changes in salinity, changes in desiccation, how quickly organisms dry out, as well as temperature, heat, sunlight exposure, predation, you name it. So these changes are frequent enough that organisms have actually adapted very specific adaptations to survive in these conditions. Okay, now I want to start thinking a little bit about how biodiversity recovers after a natural disruption. And that's going to depend on two factors. The resistance, which is how is an ecosystem able to remain unchanged when a disturbance comes along, and the resilience. How quickly is an ecosystem able to bounce back and return to how it was beforehand. Here's a nice little graphic to understand the difference between the two. A resistant ecosystem resists change from disturbances. A resilient ecosystem changes when a disturbance comes along, but it can bounce back. Ideally, you want an ecosystem to be both. Ecological succession is this process here. How does an ecosystem recover after a disturbance? And it's defined as the gradual replacement of a plant community by another through natural processes over very, very, very long periods of time. Two types that we'll talk about in this class: primary and secondary succession. And here's an example of secondary succession where the ecosystem after a fire starts to recover over some time. So let's start with primary succession. This one is a little bit more little bit more to break down here. So primary succession, the way we distinguish primary and secondary succession is one criteria, and that is whether or not there is soil present. After a forest fire, soil is not destroyed. That would be secondary succession. But in primary succession, we're starting on bare rock with no soil. Things like rocks on the shoreline, or after a volcanic eruption when there's a lava flow, or after a landslide, there's no soil there, it's just rock. And that's where primary succession starts. That's the distinguishing criteria between primary and secondary succession. After that, after the rock is exposed, pioneer species will show up and colonize the area first. Pioneer species are called that because they're pioneering in the area, and they can survive because they're especially adapted to ecosystems that don't have soil. Well, I guess most ecosystems have soil, but they're specialized to surfaces that don't need soil. These are things like lichens and moss that can grow directly on rock. And what these lichens and moss are going to do is, over time, they're going to help rebuild the soil over a very, very long time. And they're going to do that in a couple of ways. One, they're going to build up over time and they're going to die. And their organic matter will decompose and start building up layers and layers of organic tissue, which will start to formulate soil. But they will also grow and shrink with the climate. Lichens get bigger when it's wet, and they dry out when they shrink. And that's going to help crack the rock and break off little pieces. They can also sometimes secrete acid, which help breaks down the rock. And then also the rock is going to get weathered away by wind and rain. All of those things are going to help contribute towards soil formation. Don't have to worry about soil formation so much right now. We won't talk about that until Unit 4. But this is a bit of a primer. As the soil continues to form, right, more species are going to be able to arrive. So over time, the rock is going to get broken down, organic matter is going to build up, and eventually the soil will be thick enough that things like secondary species, as I call them, like ferns and other mosses, maybe some small plants, will be able to arrive, and they too will die. They will decompose and contribute to richer, thicker soil. They will also help retain water in the soil and provide more shade for some species that can't survive in harsh light conditions. As the soil gets thicker and deeper and richer, grasses and flowers will move in, shrubs and trees will then move in. As you can see here, grasses move in, then shrubs and trees move in. Flowers allow pollinators to show up, and when pollinators show up, start allowing fruits to be produced, insects and small mammals will start to show up, and then larger animals will come, and some of them will live in trees, and they will prey on the smaller mammals and the insects, and eventually we're going to reach what is called a climax community, and that is basically when the ecosystem has returned to how it was before the disturbance. This takes a long time. It does not happen overnight. It does not happen in a decade. It does not happen in 100 years. It takes hundreds and hundreds of years for soil to form and then for that soil to support a fully grown ecosystem. Okay? That's why disturbances can be so detrimental, is because they don't heal overnight. They don't heal even in a human lifetime. They heal over multiple generations. And as succession continues, the characteristics of an ecosystem are going to change. Take a guess. As succession continues on, as this process continues, what do you think is going to happen to the biomass, the species richness, the primary productivity, and the competition? Spoiler alert, they're all going to increase. More plants means more biomass. More species biodiversity means more productivity, and it means more competition for space, for light, for nutrients, etc. Eventually, they will reach this climax community, which is the end result of succession. It's a stable group of plants and animals. It doesn't always mean big trees. It's not always forests. In prairies, it's grasses, and in cacti, or in deserts, it's cacti. So it looks a little bit different depending on your ecosystem. Here's another diagram showing primary succession. Secondary succession, like I already said, is a little bit different in that it starts with soil. So it happens a lot faster because of that. We don't have to wait for soil formation. It might take 100 to 150 years instead of 2 to 3 to 400. The pioneer species tend to be a little bit different. It don't tend to be lichens and moss because there's already soil there. So weeds and grasses can arrive right away. And this tends to be after like major forest fires or big harvests from your crops or slash and burn agriculture, things like that. And here's that diagram I showed earlier. So that's pretty much it. I know it's a lot to take in between ecological tolerance and succession, but mull that over and bring questions to class next time. I will see you then.